So, whenever we talk about ethical hacking, there is always networking involved. And many people ask that why is networking important? So, the reason is very simple. If I have to explain it to a common man, I would say that to extract a data from a system, you need to know its language, how it is communicating, so that you can exploit it and retrieve the data that you want. So that is why networking is very important. So if you know that how the system works, what all services work, how the services work, then you can exploit the system and the services very easily. Hence networking is very important. So networking involves a lot of components, routers, switches, protocols, everything. In this particular course, we will be considering those things which are required for network penetration testing. So in this course, we will be covering those topics from networking like IP, MAC addresses, what are the different protocols, how does TCP work, and so on. So we will not go into routers, etc. So let's first understand what actually is the IP address. So every machine on a computer network has a unique identifier. So just like you have a mobile number and it is unique and it belongs to you. Similar is the case with IP address. It is a unique entity, unique identifier that belongs to you. So command to check IP address in Linux environment is ifconfig or IP space A, and command to check IP in Windows environment is ipconfig. So there are two versions of IP addresses, IPv4 and IPv6. And if we talk about types of IP addresses, then there are two types, public and private. So let me tell you what the difference is actually. So after you have opened the terminal, type sudo ifconfig. So this IP address which is mentioned, this is the private IP address. Okay, I will explain what it is actually, but just to show you, this is the private IP address. Now what is the public IP address? Go to Google and simply search for MySpace IP. It will show you your public IP address. Now what the difference is actually, so if I visit the terminal, gedit test.txt. So just to explain you, let's assume there are 5 computers in a network, okay? And there is one router from which they all are connected. So it is naturally that these 5 computer slash devices, I mean it can be anything like it can be anything, printer, mobile, tablet, anything. So these 5 things all will have different IP addresses. Okay, now these different IP addresses are known as private IP addresses. So for example, computer 1 has 192.168.1.1, the second one has 192.168.1.2. Similarly, the third one has .3, fourth one has .4, and fifth one has .5. So the 5 devices have different private IP addresses. But if you check their public IP addresses, that will be the same. Why? Because they are connected to the same router. So for example, if this computer wants to communicate through this computer, then that would be done internally using private IP addresses. This can directly communicate to this. However, if this computer wants to communicate to some outer computer which is not present inside their network, then the request will go through this IP address to the other network. Now to make it more clear, now let's say there is router A of network 1 and router B in some another network 2. Okay, this has 3 systems and this router has 2 systems. Okay, now you must be wondering that I said every IP address is unique and different, then how come these are same? Like this is 192.168.1.1 and this is also the same exact IP address. Same thing goes with this thing also. So So when we are talking about private IP addresses, then each device should have a different IP address within a network. So 1.3 no one has in this network, that is fine. 1.2 no one has in this network, that is absolutely fine. But when we are talking about public IP addresses, that will always be different. So for example, for router A, the public IP address is this. Then naturally the public IP address for router B will be something different. Public IP addresses are always unique and the private IP addresses are unique within a network. And one more thing, these IP keeps on changing. For example, if you have 1.1 today, after like 5-6 days when you like restart your computer, you might be having 1.5. So these IP addresses, they keep on changing. So now I hope that you have understood that what an IP address is and what are the difference between private and public IP addresses. Now let's talk about the two versions, IPv4 and IPv6. So IPv4, let's consider that first. It has 32 bits, which means 4 octets. So octet basically means 8, okay? And 4 octets means that there are 4 divisions of 8 bit each. So as you can see clearly, these are 8 bits in the first half, 8 bits in the second half, 8 bits in the third half, and 8 bits in the last part. Okay, so there are 4 parts, each represented by x over here, and each x is known as octet. So this is one octet, this is second octet, this is third octet, and this part is the fourth octet. Each octet is separated by a single dot, and if you count each 1 and 0 over here, there are 32 bits. So for example, this is the IP address 192.168.2.4. So I need to convert it into binary. Then it is very simple. Simply represent each number into binary. So there can be online tools also, or if you know how to do it manually, that is great. Simply type 192 into binary, search it on Google, you will get the answer. So 192 looks like this. Okay, 168 looks like this. Basically there are power of 2's. So 2, this is column for 2 raised to the power 0, 2 raised to the power 1. So I won't go into much mathematics over here because there are a lot of people watching from non-mathematical background. So if you want to convert this thing into binary, simply search 192 in binary, 168 in binary, go and search on Google. So now 2 in binary is represented as 10, but since we have to represent it in 8 bits, so it becomes 00000 and then 10. Okay, so this becomes the complete representation of the above IP. So the key point here is that IPv4 is 32-bit, it has 4 octets. Like someone can ask this in an interview, a very casual question, so you need to know this. Next comes IPv6. So IPv6 was invented because IPv4 had very less number of IP addresses, and these days like everyone owns 5 to 6 devices, so there are large corporations also where they have lot of routers and so on. So IPv4 gets exhausted over there. The IPs are very limited. Hence IPv6 was invented so that every device can be assigned an IP address. So it has 8 groups of hexadecimal. Hexadecimal basically means 0 to 9 and A to F. These characters are involved. So as you can see, there are 8 groups: first group, second, third, fourth, fifth, sixth, seventh, and eighth. So if there are any consecutive zeros in between, they can also be represented by just this. We can remove these zeros and it is understood that in between there are zeros. Okay. So this was the basic understanding of IPv6. If anyone asks you question about IPv6, it would generally be that how many bits are there in IPv6, how many groups of hexadecimals are there, what all characters are allowed, then you have to say hexadecimal characters. So this is the stuff that can be like asked about IPv6, and now you have the basic understanding that what an IP address actually is. So there are certain IP addresses which are very important and you should know about them. So 0.0.0.0, it is the default network, which is abstract concept of just being connected to TCP IP network. Okay. 255.255.255.255 is the last IP address, and it is reserved for all network broadcast. So for example, if one computer sends a message to this IP address, then so that means it is broadcasting the message and sending the message to each and every device. And last is 127.0.0.1. So it is an IP address that you will be using very frequently in the coming tutorials. Why? Because this is loopback address or the computer's way of identifying itself. Like in English we say this is my, so 127.0.0.1 is equivalent to the word my, whether or not it has an assigned IP address. So that means 127.0.0.1 anyone can open on his or her computer, and that will be the local host. Generally it is used for testing purposes to host websites locally, and since we have to simulate attacks, so we will be using this IP address very frequently. So I hope that every major concept about IP address is clear to you. Thank you for watching this tutorial.